My name is Martha Mutisi. I'm a senior program officer with the Governance and Justice Program here at the International Development Research Center. With me is a very esteemed panel comprising of IDRC-supported researchers from different countries. First, we have Jeanine Abatan, a researcher from the Institute of Security Studies based in Senegal. And then we have Malose Langa, who is also a senior researcher from the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation, a think tank and NGO based in South Africa. And then we have Celina Sola, who is going to be joining us later, who is with Glasswing, which is based in El Salvador. We also have William John Walwa, who is an assistant professor at the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. So the researchers are really going to share with us the insights and findings from their research, from their various research projects, which are looking at the question of youth from different perspectives. So to start, we'll have Jeanine Abatan to present insights from the IISS study.
Thank you, Martha. Good morning, everyone. I would like to start by thanking IDRC and its partner for inviting the Institute for Security Studies to participate in this important event that is of interest to the Institute, but also to myself as a young researcher working on some of these complex security issues. And today I will be speaking from the perspective of someone that is coordinating a project in Mali and Niger on young people resilience and engagement in violent extremist groups. And my presentation will be structured as follows. First, I'll give you the context of this research. I'll give you the value added of the research to the youth peace and security agenda that we're talking about today, and also finish with the preliminary policy implication of this research. So in a context, so we're talking about bringing it to context here, we're talking about West Africa, a context where we have seen a multiplication of violent extremist groups, a multiplication of attack, but also a persistence of the violent extremist threat. The aim of this study entitled Responding to Young Men and Women, when we're talking about young people here, we're talking about young men and young women, engagement and resilience to violent extremist group, is to understand why and how young people engage in violent extremist group. When they find themselves in violent extremist group, why did they decide, or how do they decide to stay in those groups, and how and why do they leave those violent extremist groups? What are the different roles that they play in violent extremist group? But also, more importantly, during this morning section, we talk about the fact that young are perpetrators of violence, but they also decide to not engage in violent extremist group. And this study aims to understand why other young people living in the same context as that of those that engage in violent extremist group, how did they manage not to find themselves in a violent extremist group? We are conducting this research in central Mali, in the region of Mopti and Ségou, and in Niger, in the region of Difa. So the Boko Haram front in Niger and the Sahelian front, ACMI, in Mali. So what is the value added of this research to the youth peace and security agenda? The first value added of this research is that we engage in young people. We talk about inclusivity this morning. We engage in young people in the understanding of the problematic of the problem, but also in finding solution. And as part of this project, young people are the one leading the project, young people such as myself, but we also build in this project a capacity building component for 3 young researchers from the country where we are undertaking the research, so from Mali and Niger. And the aim for us is for those young people, because they are from the context, they are from the country, for them to contribute to understanding the problem, and also for us to move beyond seeing young people as object of research, them contributing to shaping the policy responses to prevent and counter violent extremism in the context where we are undertaking the research. Also, in the report, I was reading the report, and the report mentioned the fact that there is often a reluctance to engage young people perpetrators, to listen or even hear young people that are perpetrators of violent violent extremist group, and sometimes it's for legitimate security and legal impediment. And maybe during the question and answer period, I'll come back to some of the challenges that we face. But we think that if we want to understand such a complex issue, such as violent extremism, it is important that we move away from perception study, because any blind spot in our understanding of the issue might also lead to blind spot in the way we respond to it. So in our methodology, we are engaging young people that are present in violent extremist group. We are engaging young people that were present in violent extremist group and now are in the community or in prison setting. But we're also engaging young people that are not engaged in violent extremist group. And today we have conducted more than 70 interviews with young people that are engaged and formally engaged, and also more than 80 with young people that decided not to engage in those in violent extremist group. I'll finish with the preliminary policy implication of the research. The first implication is that we need to recognize that young people have agency. And in contexts such as, and here I'll be reading some life story of the people that we met during the study. This woman from Niger, she said Boko Haram members are everywhere. They are our brothers or husband. In contexts where violent extremist groups are present within community, young people are victims. They are also target of violent extremist group, but they have also crafted positive and negative adaptive strategy to be able to survive in such contexts. I was think for a second, what will you do if you are in an area controlled by violent extremist group? You have to develop strategy to survive. And in the case of our study, some young people engage willingly in violent extremist group, but beside that, other people that engage, whether willingly or unwillingly in violent extremist group, decided willingly to disengage, to leave those groups. So I think talking about engagement, we also need to look into how young people decide to leave violent extremist group. And I will be sharing with you the story of this young man from Niger. He said, a friend to whom I refused to lend money told the military that I belonged to Boko Haram. I contacted the head of the military mission to explain that I was innocent, but he did not believe me. 2 days later, I joined Boko Haram voluntarily. It was my only way out. I was a combatant. I stayed in the group for fear of being killed by the military or the civilian population. I left the group with 2 of my friends after hearing about the Niger amnesty program. So in that context, you see again, this person that engaged willingly, but also willingly decided to disengage because of a government response. But in the same context, other young people decided not to engage in violent extremist group. And I will share with you the story of this man. He said, Boko Haram is present in my area. My older brother joined them. When he failed to recruit me, he tried to kill me and my father. I decided to leave my village. I went to the city of Difa, that is in Niger again. So you see again some of the strategy crafted by young people is either to flee the region where young violent extremist groups are present, or to join watch group. Other young people in Niger have also decided to join youth organizations working to prevent or counter violent extremism. The second policy implication, and this was pointed out in the report itself, the factors that explain young people engagement in violence are multiple. Sometimes they're dynamic and they overlap. And I will share with you the life story of two people that we met. One of a woman, showing that women also engage in violent extremist group. She said, Boko Haram tried to recruit me as well. I refused. I don't believe in their practices. My parent and all the village religious leaders reject the group action. The second life story, a man from Mali, he said, I resisted several recruitment attempts by Amadou Koufa group, that is Kapitiba Masina, that operate in central Mali. I did not join them because I do not share their opinions. I think jihad, as they portray it, is not what I learned in the Quran. My parent and my family also warned me about them. So you see again that there's an admixture of factors that explain why young people don't engage in violent extremist group. And they range from personal to social factors, the role influence of family members, religious leaders. And the third policy implication, this was also pointed out in the report, we often hear unemployed youth are the ones that engage in violent extremist group. But in the case of our study, we realized that some people engage in those groups for reasons that has nothing to do with economic reason. Other people engage for economic reason, but unemployment is just one explanation of that broad variety of economic reason. And this life story of a woman we met in Mali is interesting. She said, I am a trader. One day on our way back from Ouagadougou, capital of Burkina Faso, Amadou Kufa group stopped us. They took our goods. They returned mine on the condition that I bring them rice and share butter every week. I accepted to continue my business. This shows again that some young people engage or accept to collaborate with violent extremist groups to protect their activity. So we need to accept the complexity of violent extremism and not keep our explanation just to unemployment. Why do young people that don't have job get involved in violent extremist groups? And I will finish with this policy implication. Government responses need to be context and need specific. Government response we cannot keep on copy-pasting responses, because what is true for one country might not be true for the other. And what is true for one locality in one country might not be true for the other locality. So as the report rightly pointed out, government response need to move beyond fear and panic. It needs to be grounded on fact, and it also needs to be based on a clear comprehension of the complexity of violent extremism. Thank you, and I thank you for your indulgence. No, thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeanine, Ella. I think very, very interesting insights coming from the study by the Institute of Security Studies. And for me, what really spoke to me was the intentionality in the methodology to ensure that the study is not only youth-led on paper, but also intentionally ensures that young people are actually taking a lead role in designing the research and undertaking the research. Also very interesting findings coming from the study sites. For example, the highlighting of the complexity of youth participation in things like violent extremism, and a decision by the research team to really not fall prone to demonizing youth as vehicles of violence, but also to look at some of the things that young people do in order to stay out of violence, some of the decision-making processes that come in, and the factors that affect young people's decision to choose to participate or not to participate. We'll move on from the ISS study to the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation, where Malose Langa will also talk about the CSVR research, which looks at public employment programs with a particular focus on young people, and also how this study interacts with the YPS progress study.
Thanks, Martha. I'm Malose Langa, representing CSVR, an organization that Graham started in 1989. So I guess Graham comes a long way with the issue around no violence, no prevention. So the organization is still intact, Graham. So, I mean, given time constraints, I'll try and keep, how many minutes do I have? Five minutes? 10 minutes. On my way here, I used KLM, and in the flight there was a booklet which I read about places to visit, and they also had something about South Africa. And then there was a mention to say, but it's a lovely country, but you need to be careful. So careful due to high level of crime. And I guess that for me summarized what I wanted to share here. That of course, when you make mention of South Africa, for a lot of people, it conjures up the image of how do you live in such a violent, country? And obviously, as a young black man, people react to you differently, because you occupy a position of being a senior researcher, and then immediately people think, why are you not one of them? So obviously here the key point is that not all young people in South Africa are involved in criminal activities. So a quick background information is that in 2009 and 2010, I did a research around what we call community protest in South Africa. And in doing this, obviously, it was around mainly young people feeling disgruntled about lack of basic services. But in doing this research, around the involvement in violent, protests or public protest, there were also young people that were not involved in this protests. And there is where our question arose, to say, what is it that prevent other young people to be involved in all forms of violence, including public protests. So we did two research projects, both funded by IDRC, and included about 6 communities. And then the second phase, we involved 4 communities, where it was mainly training young people on violence prevention skills. But in this project, we're assessing a government project, which was developed in 2008, called CWP, Community Work Program, which is a public program. So this program, when it was developed, it was mainly to create job opportunities. What basically happened, due to a high rate of unemployment, the state has decided to create this program. So in this program, people work 2 days a week, and they get paid 76 rand per day. I'm not sure how much will that be in terms of US dollars, but it's a minimal amount of money. There's nothing much that you can do with that money. But what makes the difference is that with the work that people do, they must do the work that is considered to be good for the community. So obviously, in terms of its conception, the project, it is not a violence prevention program, but in researching it, we found that it has a potential to become a crime and a violence prevention program, given some of the activities that the members of this program engage in. And some of the activities include community patrols and the clearing of long grass in crime hotspots, and also all kinds of social programs aimed at dealing with the problem of alcohol abuse, and also involvement of young people in recreation and sporting activities, and also their work in early childhood development programs, and some also do home-based care activities. And then you also have young people and coming out of jail, and many of them, they struggle to find job opportunities, given their criminal records. So part of this program, they get recruited, and then they work in different programs as young people who are in jail. But despite the fact that you have young people involved in this program, it's always very difficult, especially in other communities, to sell the project, to many young people to actively participate in the program. And then the issue, which I guess was also raised in the YPS study, is the issue of gender. So when you look at this program, mainly the work that gets done for many young men, the work is seen as too feminine, because the work involves home-based care activities, cleaning of streets, and working with the elderly, or working with young children, or working in schools, and obviously the young black men hardly participate in some of these activities. And also the issue of political patronage and interference in selecting participants. So obviously the participation in this program is that it is open to everyone. So in each community there will be about 1,000 people that participate, and at times you find that the program is oversubscribed. You have more than 1,000 people wanting to participate in the program. So as a result of that, you have an interference from local councillors with all kinds of allegations of nepotism and so on and so forth. But also the issue of payment, in terms of the SDGs goals, there's a goal where it talks about decent work. So there are a lot of questions if whether this qualifies as work or not. But also the issues of the money that people get, it's not enough, for them to live a decent like But the key findings which were written in different policies is that though the program was not developed as a violence prevention project, it does have the capacity, especially when we look at our findings, to prevent violence in various ways. And of course, this differs from one community to the next. And obviously where we are at is that on the whole, when we look at the findings of the project, is that it does contribute to economic and social inclusion of young people in South Africa, and directly and indirectly it contributes to violence and peace building initiatives. And of course, these are the people that we wish to acknowledge. Obviously, the funding that we received from the IDRC and the colleagues that I worked with on this project. Okay.
Thank you, Malose. Thank you for sharing the insights from the study by the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation. Quite interesting how the study was really based on grounded theory. It's the data, the findings that led you to theorize the relationship between government's investment in socio-economic opportunities and community or works programs could have a potential impact on building social cohesion in communities. Even though that was not the intention of the community's works programs, there's beginning to be copious amount of evidence that are emerging that there's a linkage when government invests in socio-economic opportunities, even though they're paying minimal wages, but also they are addressing community needs. There's a bit of social cohesion that is built as a result of such processes. So questions emerge about how to build on this evidence and how to scale up. But we'll discuss this in due course. Our next presenter is Dr. William Walwa. I'd like to welcome Celina, also who has just joined us from Glasswing. Thank you so much for making it to the panel. So we have William Walwa. He's going to talk to us about the research that the University of Dar es Salaam is doing in Tanzania on community-led security mechanisms that are led by young people in early warning and violence prevention.
Yeah, thank you so much, Martha, and I also must start by extending appreciation to the IDRC for inviting us to come down here. So I'm from the University of Salaam, and when I was looking at the report, there was only a single mention of Tanzania, and not even a case study only from Tanzania, but I understand, and I think that is one of the methodological challenges of doing this kind of research. We have a tendency of focusing on what I consider as hotspot areas where there are problems, and quite often forgetting to look at where there are no problems, at least to learn. But I think it's quite interesting, and in the first part of my presentation, I'll kind of link what we are doing in connection to the report. So the research by the University of Salaam is looking at the community aid warning mechanisms in Tanzania and Kenya. And we are trying to examine how the community aid warning mechanisms are essentially arenas for youth engagement to find solutions to violent extremism. And where did this come from? If you look at Kenya and Tanzania, of late, these two countries have different experiences, but in general terms, there are growing cases of violence in the two countries. But of course, a lot more of the studies have tried to explain what the reasons are, but of course, quite often painting a negative image on the youth as the source of the problem, and there is little that has been done to explain, for instance, the youth agency in terms of finding solutions to the problems. And so Tanzania more specifically, if you look at Africa, we have had such a good history in the sense that if you look at Africa, we had quotas, the religious polarization, the political polarization, but that has not been the case in Tanzania. And it is quite often, I don't know, unlike South Africa, it's quite often called an also peace in Africa. I don't know why. But of course, the last few years we have seen an increased number of violent conflicts. But one of the institutions which people talk a lot about Tanzania is called the Nyumba Kumi, a 10-cell leadership system, which was established during at independence, I think after independence, to organize the community at the local level. And it has been one of the success in terms of addressing the conflicts and violence in that respect. Now, strangely enough, some 5 years ago, Kenya picked up this idea and they went to implement it in Kenya, the Nyumba Kumi system, the 10-cell leadership system. But in Tanzania, actually, it was disbanded some few years ago. But it, of course, it continues to work even though it was disbanded. So, in terms of the value addition of our research, we're actually trying to address three core research gaps. One is the one which connects to the discussion we have here, the victim perpetrators violence discourse, which tends to look at youth as either the victim of conflicts or as either the perpetrator of conflicts. And we are trying to demystify that by providing empirical evidence. And of course, the second one relates to the fact that if you look at our governments, there is of course the questions about policy panic, and there is a panic which is quite often not driven from evidence. So we are trying to provide evidence to inform the government engagement and of course the CSO in terms of addressing the problems pertaining to youth. But also there is a question about the importance of gender, which is quite often ignored. And of course people talk about community aid warning system, but there is less mention of different segments of the community in which way they engage. And more specifically, there is always less mention about the contribution that women bring on the table, girls, boys, etc. Now, I just want to draw the relation between our research with the report that we discussed in the morning. if you look at the report, and I think it was some kind of speaking about our research more specifically, especially the three strategies: inclusion, investment, and partnership. And our research has uncovered in the first place that we only could address insecurities when we recognize the partnership that the youth, and the more specific, the investment, the contribution that the youth bring on the table. And of course, I'll talk about the funding, but I think in the areas where the security forces have embraced partnership with the youth, they have been able to sustainably address the violent incidents. But I think also the other question is the question about investment in youth. And I think that's a big, and of course in the morning there were discussions, and I think one of the challenges we are seeing in our context is the fact that there are lots of political rhetorics that youth, we're doing a lot of investment, but I think if you go to the local level, there is little investment actually. For instance, in Tanzania, there is a policy which requires all the local governments in the country to set aside 10% of their budget, which would be used to finance youth and women initiatives at the local level. But in a good number of the councils, neither of the councils actually complies, and there is the policy. But of course, the politician will always say, oh, there is this policy, and there is always money for the youth, but where is the money? So the policy and the political talks and what happens at the local level. Now, at the level of the findings, quickly, and I think I'll speak about two case studies. One case study is about, in Africa, if you go to any of the African cities, you'll see enormous number of youth. We call them boda, the motorcycle drivers. And these are the guys who are shaping the economies in the city. But I think also the other cases studies about the returnees, groups of youth that have been to Somalia and have joined Al-Shabaab and have come back. What do you do with this kind of group? Now, let's start with the boda. And I think in terms of theorization, I would think questions about livelihoods are so critical. A good number of research on livelihood, and I think more specific violence in Africa, they have tended to paint a negative image of youth that actually youth have a tendency of taking advantage of violent conflicts in order to reap benefits. But of course, for the boda drivers, some of the challenges they are facing, for instance, what to do with marginalization, brutality from the police. And of late, they resolved on their own to work in associations, and associations trying to address the root cause of the problem at the local level, and of course paint a positive image that actually what we are doing is good for the community. And some of the drivers that why would they, what were the reasons as why they come together? One, of course, the question about threats of their livelihoods, that increasingly there was this negative image, and some of the people were running away from them. And of course, the marginalization, which is very critical. And in a good number of areas where they have organized together and formed and worked in associations, there is evidence in our research that actually violent conflicts have been addressed. And in the areas where also the government has embraced that, actually is evidence that actually questions about insecurities have been addressed. And the question is the question about returnees. If you go to Kwale in Kenya, there are about 350 in estimation youth that have been to Somalia. They have come back home, but they are in the black books of the police. And so they need to find a solution. They need to leave. They have been to Somalia, yes, but they need to leave. What do you do with these people? The government have had no solution. The government solution has always been state-centric in the sense that find them, arrest them, and in the worst case scenario, kill them. So the government had failed to come with a solution. It is only a group of youth in this area who said, well, should we continue killing them? They are running away, and sometimes they are also retaliating to kill the police. And so they decided to form an association that would work with the youth that have been radicalized. And this association decided to categorize the youth put them into 3 categories. One is the most radicalized that have been to Somalia, 2, the youth at risk that were being radicalized, and 3, the youth that are moderately radicalized. And increasingly in the work of the associations, there are actually new opportunities emerging, that the youth that have run away, who will be called extremists, they are coming together to find solutions. And in some of the stories I was getting, I think in one of the interviews we attended, maybe the government does want to listen. If only you could listen to someone who has been to Somalia, also I think there is a lot that you could learn. One of the young men said, actually, there is no jihad in Somalia. That is an economic war, in his view. He thinks that he was manipulated, and he thinks he needs to come together in his community and find a solution. But he says, if only I go to the police and say, I also want to live in this community, they will kill me. So the state-centric approach is never giving them opportunity to find a solution and to listen to the stories that took them to Somalia. Now, at the level of policy implications, actually, we have uncovered that youth inclusion pays. And we are seeing youth not as a problem, but a source of resilience. In the areas where youth participation and partnership has been embraced, we've seen positive development towards sustainable peace. And in the area where youth partnership has not been embraced, we're seeing worst-case scenarios of youth either retaliating against the police and security forces instead of being a partnering with the police. But also, at the level of policy implication, we are seeing the fact that where the government has started to embrace our findings, we're seeing also more positive change. And of course, there are cases where the government is increasingly lacking policy at the local level to embrace the funding that we're producing. And this is actually paying. So in short, there is a lot of assets that we can harness from youth, if only we give them a chance to be listened in the community. And if only we accept to partner with them and appreciate the contribution that they are providing to the community. Thank you so much.
Thank you, William. UDSM, or University of Dar es Salaam, reiterating the findings of the global study that youth inclusion is actually smart. It pays. It pays when communities, governments, and local leaders recognize that the demographic dividend is also a peace dividend. It pays when endogenous structures, which were usually exclusive, recognize that the participation of young people actually is to their advantage. It unleashes their creativity and their innovation, and it transforms the peace and security landscape. Let's move on to Glasswing. We have Celina. Again, I'm very thankful for your dedication and commitment to this process. Celina, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, first I want to apologize. I think the universe conspired against my coming. I was bumped off the flight yesterday, and the flight today was an hour and a half late, so really, really apologize. And I want to thank IDRC for the opportunity to be here. I'm humbled by everybody who's here and the level of rigor in the research, and I'm really looking forward to at least spending the afternoon and hopefully reading some of these abstracts. I think I just want to start with kind of a disclaimer. So Glasswing is an implementer. We're a nonprofit that addresses the root causes of violence and poverty, and we partner with research institutions. And in this initiative that I'm going to talk about today, we've been partnering not only with IDRC, but also with the Inter-American Development Bank and FUSADES, that's a local research institution based in El Salvador. I'm from El Salvador, and so this is an initiative that I think is really providing us with new ways of approaching youth violence prevention, because that's what we do every single day in our work. Again, we do a lot of practice-based research with research partners, and we're the primary implementers of these initiatives. And our goal is to generate evidence so we can affect policy in our context, not just in El Salvador, but throughout the region. Thank you. So El Salvador is one of the most dangerous places in the world, not just to be young, but in general, statistically. There's a huge lack of opportunity, and we also share the stigma that I'm sure has been mentioned repeatedly this morning. We share the problem of youth stigma and social exclusion. So we have, decades and decades of torn social fabric, which has been made worse by a growing gang problem. And the problem is that the focus of a lot of interventions is on addressing a gang problem and not addressing the root causes. And the fact that young people end up getting involved in lives of crime and violence because of a lack of opportunity and not by choice, and because of their exposure to violence and trauma. So the limited freedom of movement and the lack of opportunities really ends up giving them so little. I mean, they literally sometimes can't cross the street because the territory is divided up by different gang-controlled territories. So what we wanted to find out is, how can we address these increasing levels of violence and the lack of opportunities through an initiative? We had done aspects of this before, but we hadn't combined this mix of social entrepreneurship, engaging and including young people and we had worked with young people being at the center of developing these solutions, but not bringing in innovation and social entrepreneurship, which tend to be, at least in Latin America, for a higher level of education and a more exclusive and elite kind of programming. I'm just going to present, go to the next slide. So these are some statistics, and you can read most of them, but just to give you a sense, and I think we share a lot of these with the rest of the Southern Hemisphere, almost 57% of the population is under 29, and most of the violence affects this age of the population. So it's essentially the most important generations being most affected, and are either victims of or perpetrators or both. As we understand violence in the region and in most places, you're usually a victim before you're a perpetrator. I just want to underscore a few of these statistics. When this concept of ninis in Spanish, where they're not working and not in school or not working, this reflects kind of this exclusion of young people. So I do want to emphasize this kind of double exclusion, and also emphasize that women are most affected by this. The levels of violence in El Salvador, we have the highest rate of femicide globally. And that's staggering. And also 1 in 3 pregnancies in El Salvador is in a teenage girl. So girls are not only weighed down by the lack of opportunity and that they have to deal with the duties of the home, they also are more victims of, they suffer a lot from this victimization in terms of violence. We have also the immigration problem. 145,000 people on average emigrate annually, and 63% of these are under 25 years old. So I just added those that weren't on there because I think they're important. This project is basically what we're doing is we're looking at, if I go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So we're looking at this not just as an employment challenge, but also as a violence prevention and youth opportunity and inclusion exercise. Oh, thanks. I was wondering where that was. That's helpful. So what we have is basically, how do we bring different sectors together, the private sector, and my colleague was mentioning the importance of working across sectors and also with government. We're bringing these sectors together to have basically youth-led initiatives through social innovation and entrepreneurship that can address the problems that they know better than anybody else. And that, at the end of the day, for us, it's having, I think that skipped a slide, but it's okay. Our proposal and our work with IDRC has been to accompany implementation with research that, it's okay, I think I just had an extra slide. Basically, we're implementing with young people in socially excluded communities. In El Salvador, we're working in public schools with that high school age group to implement innovation programs. We're working with university students who are a smaller group, and we're also working with this population of youth that is neither in school nor studying. And the majority of our participants are female. So what we're looking at, and one of the things that I want to mention before I finish up, because I just have a couple minutes, the importance of this is the inclusion of young people that are marginalized and stigmatized is of absolute importance in this context because of the stigma, and to change that perception and to get policymakers to think of young people as assets, not as liabilities. That's easier said than done. So it's like almost a rebranding of young people. And I also want to mention that one thing that's come out of it early, because we're still early in the stages, we've just done the basic research, which has looked a lot at stigma and looked a lot at the fact that the skills that they need to be entrepreneurs, we need to upskill young people from these communities significantly in order to get them to the stage where they can launch their ventures. But one of the things that I really want to emphasize, and one of the things that came up, which is very interesting from a gender perspective, is that we have a combination of a challenge and an opportunity where the coverage for early childhood development is under 2%. And women are excluded significantly from the formal economy. So what we're seeing right now, the government just passed a law to require the companies pay for their employees to have early child care. So we're looking at an amazing opportunity right now to work with women and young men and develop a workforce, essentially, together with government, private sector, a new workforce for this gap that we have in the country, which is also going to obviously contribute to incredibly important development outcomes. As we know, the first years of life are critical, and it also gives women an opportunity to work from home. So that's one of the main challenges that was posed by the young people that we're working with, and also by the context in the country that we're working in. So our investment, together with the IADB and IDRC and FUSADES, is to really develop these models and these approaches that destigmatize and rebrand youth. Oh, there it was, I had it reversed. And make youth change agents and ensure that in the future we have a context where we can have more youth-led initiatives to address the problems that they know better than anybody else, and really put women and young women at the center of this as well, because they've been more marginalized even than their male counterparts. So the initiative is called Núcleo, and our kind of motto is in Spanish, it's like, it's basically this concept of being idealistic, but also grounding your feet and being able to execute what we're trying to accomplish. Thank you.
Thank you, Celina. Again, riveting findings. I think for me, what stood out is the deliberate gendered approach, the emphasis on women-led enterprises, but also the recognition that there is an opportunity for combining an economic approach with a tacit recognition that young people are beyond economic beings. They're also social beings with a sense of belonging. They're psychological beings. How do we marry those approaches together in order to build resilient societies? So at this stage, I'm going to open this up to the floor, to the audience, so that we can also have an interaction with the IDRC-supported researchers to find out more about their research, their results, as well as maybe what they plan to do next. So I'll take a round of maybe 2 or 3, and then, yes. Colin.
Thanks very much. Those were 4 really interesting presentations. And one of the things that sort of jumped to mind for me, and I didn't hear in any of the presentations, but I'm wondering if any of you could speak to this, is in having, for me, El Salvador is a really poignant example, because I was actually there during the demobilization of the FMLN, and kind of the challenges of trying to reintegrate young people into society. And even the word reintegration was really problematic, because so many people had values that they held very dear, and they sort of said, we don't really want to reintegrate into that status quo ante. You know, we were resisting and actually trying to change things for a reason. So one of the things that struck me in that experience and in a lot of experience in trying to re-engage young people in an employment generation is just the utter feeling of loneliness. So there's the kind of the whole feeling of, yes, I want to have a job, I need to move just beyond a job, but I mean, sometimes the reason, in my experience, that people also join up is just for this feeling of sort of camaraderie, and some of the really interesting research I've seen that Interpeace has done on gangs in El Salvador is, you know, kind of this whole idea of being part of a club. And so when you're sort of trying to pull people out of that structure and move them into kind of more constructive structures, what are some of the strategies or tactics that we can think about building into programs so that people actually feel connected? Because, you know, people often want to feel connected to a community. And so if we're asking them to abandon one community, as damaging and harmful as it might be to society, what are we offering them to be joining up with a new community in things like employment generation? So I'm just kind of wondering if, from your experience, are there some lessons we could hear about that?
Do you want to just take all the questions? Can I take two more, and then we so that also other panel members can respond? Yes.
Thank you. I think I'm going to ask my question in French because I'm talking particularly to the Mali-Niger team. So merci.
Do you want me to speak English or French? Okay. Your study is quite interesting because compared to the other cases, you're the only team or the country where the conflict is still ongoing. So the other cases is post-conflict, whereas for you, you're in the midst of this conflict. So based on your results, what are your intentions? We know what's happening with Boko Haram. This terrorist group is still active. What do you plan to do with the results of your project, especially in Mali? Last week, we saw everything, we saw what's happening there and all the violence there. So what's your action plan?
My question is mostly to Ella, and clarity is certainly not my strength, but I will try. You mentioned about the amnesty program that was done in Niger. And based on what I heard Professor Williams speak about the problems of the returnees from such extremist groups and the whole issue of reintegration into societies, I wonder how successful, and this is based on my ignorance, I'm just curious to know how successful was Niger's program of amnesty. The reason I mention this is also I had some experience with the Maoist movement in Nepal. And that was almost 20 years ago. When the Maoist movement started in Nepal, a lot of women from the rural areas had actually joined the Maoist struggle, the Marxist struggle, and largely because of all the gender inequalities and the oppression they faced in the rural parts of Nepal. When the war was finally over, there was the issue of course, reintegration. They had a couple of thousands of Maoist combatants, but 1,500 were finally taken in by the army to join the rank and file. Previously, the army had resisted, the officers in the army had resisted in any way to take in. I mean, after all, these were the group that had been fighting very hard. But they did take in about 1,500. The rest were given the money, a package was made out, and fine. And so were the women. But the problem is, when the women returned back to their societies, back into their villages, they were totally stigmatized, totally rejected. And these were young girls then. It became very difficult for them to be even, their own kind rejected them. Now, if IDRC will give me some money, I would like to go back and find out what really happened to these women. Because I'm told a lot of them did go back to the cities, Kathmandu, and managed to find jobs here and there in the informal sector. Thank you.
Please, Celina.
To respond to that question, and I think you're right. I mean, we work, that's what we work on specifically with youth, and the programs, particularly the employability programs that we've found to be most successful, we have an adaptation of a program that was developed in the United States called YouthBuild and has worked internationally, but what we've found is the trauma-informed approaches to all these training programs. It's not so much the technical part of the training that matters, it's the social and emotional and the psychosocial support that can be provided, because it's really, the level of trauma is so high, and again, the reintegration in general, even if you haven't been in the prison or you're not officially in the gang, or if you are, it's a process, and a lot of it has to be done long-term. So that sense of belonging we try to create through these programs and these networks, not just through the vocational training, but also as we're building right now this cohort of entrepreneurs, we're trying to really work that through clusters of young people to address that void and address that need for a sense of belonging in a context where the social fabric is really torn everywhere.
Thank you. Thank you, Celina.
Can I also address the question about integration, which we are also seeing more specifically in Kenya, where you have a significant number of youth that have been to Somalia. They have come back home. But I think one of the challenges I'm seeing is, and I think the solution first should be, we must learn to listen. I remember in Kwale, one of the integration approach which failed, I think, some 2 years ago, was now you have the returnees from Somalia. They are at home. The politicians also want to be seen to be doing something. They never went and talked to these people because they consider them terrorists. So they came up with a very strange program, which was to give them motorcycles. They said they don't have jobs. Let's give them motorcycles. And there was even a press release with the media around that we're giving motorcycles to whoever is a returnee. And some people who are not even who have not even been to Somalia came also wanting to get the motorcycles. And in the end, you had a huge number of youth. Some have been to Somalia, yes. Some have not been to Somalia, wanting to take advantage of this integration approach to get a motorcycle. And of course, strange enough, because the community has been taught to be afraid of whoever is a returnee, he's a terrorist. Now, some of the community members that had lost their loved one start to kill the people with these motorcycles. And some of the police also intentionally start targeting the people with these motorcycles because you are terrorists. Anyways. And in the end, a good number of people abandon this motorcycle. They say, oh, well, my goodness, if this motorcycle is also killing me, what is the use of it? So the motorcycles were also abandoned. But I think the truth of the matter is that they never listen to their concerns. Do I need a motorcycle in the first place? It's just because a company somewhere had pledged to give them motorcycles, then they saw this is a solution. So I think it's important if you are to come up with a viable and practical solution at the local level. And I think also we as researchers, we have to learn to listen to what they're saying. And if only also the government can also learn to listen to what we as researchers are bringing on the table, I think we'll come up with a solution. Let's not get into the quick and fix solutions which do not necessarily work at the local level.
Thank you. Thank you, William. Yes, Malose.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's becoming quite, evident in the presentation in the morning and in our presentations just now that economic inclusion does facilitate social cohesion. And of course, if I were to make a reference to our work where you working with young people who are in jail and have come out. Obviously, there's a lot of stigma to say this person used to terrorize, community, members. And of course, now you involve this person in social, activities, having to go and take care of the elderly. And remember, before your imprisonment, you're known to be this guy who used to carry a knife, who used to carry a gun, who used to commit all these violent crimes. And of course, now it's having to embrace what would call sort of alternative masculinities of what it means to be a new young black man who is not pro-violent sort of voices. And of course, what tends to get lost, it's around that transition of you're known to be this person, and now you're trying to be a new person, but are these voices publicly sort of embraced and celebrated in those communities? So then I can also imagine for the returnees, to say you're this and now you're this person. And also for me, it's also the contradictions, to say change subjectively, it comes with a lot of costs, because even for this former gang members, there are always these temptations, these tensions that one continuously has to sort of manage. Yeah.
Thank you, Martha. So I got a couple of questions. The question about the way forward of this research. So the aim of the research, this is a policy research, and our aim is actually to make this finding, so the study is still ongoing, but the aim is to make the finding available to policymakers, because we should not be doing research for the sake of doing research, especially on certain issues such as violent extremism. Because if you see, I actually had a map that I didn't include in the presentation. The violent extremist threat has expanded from Mali to neighboring country, and now is actually trickling down to coastal state, Ghana, Benin, Togo. So on such a complex issue, we need to make sure that decision makers, that they have the information, we put at their disposal policy finding. But then sometime, and this was pointed out by Benetta this morning, implementation. You can put at a decision maker, you can give them, you can put at their disposal the finding of the research, but you have no control over whether they will use the policy research or not. However, in the case of a study that we conducted in Mali in 2016, the interesting thing that happened is that the team was invited. We conducted a study on the same, on young people. Why do young people find themselves in violent extremist group in Mali? And we were invited to take part in the committee that was drafting Mali counter-violent extremist strategy. We were invited late in that process, but the fact that we were invited already showing that policy research can actually have an impact if a researcher are engaged beforehand in policy decision. But also, researchers also need to be intentional in the way they engage decision maker. I think when we implement in research, we need to make sure that we engage decision makers from the get-go of the research to get the buy-in, so that they can also, at the end, when you have policy recommendation, you can put it at their disposal. Because sometimes we realize that decision makers are consulted at the end of a policy of a project implementation, and that has been engaging them at the get-go. You make sure that you can actually ask them what are they need in terms of policy recommendation, what are they need in terms of gap in knowledge that you need to fill. The second question was about reintegration, and it came twice. What are the challenges of reintegration? And the question to know if the Niger reintegration program has actually worked. The program is still ongoing. And in this case, we have seen that the action actually preceded the reflection. So the government called young people that are engaged in Boko Haram to leave Boko Haram. They are now in a camp in Gudumaria in Difa, and the government is now trying to see how do we reintegrate them back into society, because these are young people that left their community, joined violent extremist groups. Some of them have been forcefully enlisted in Boko Haram. So the government is trying to find, okay, how do we reintegrate these people back into society? And the solution needs to be grounded in an understanding of the reason why young people join those groups, because reintegration program need to actually cater to the need of the people. A case in Nigeria, a young girl from the girl from the Chibok girl, she was liberated from Boko Haram by the military, but she decided after some time to go back to Boko Haram re-engagement cases. So reintegration cases need to be need-specific to avoid re-engagement of young people. So in the case of our study in Niger, what the government is trying to do now is to actually understand the need of those people that are in the camp, to see how they can cater to their need. And they're working with Search for Common Ground, that undertook a study in Niger with those people in the camp to see what are their needs. Because most solution has been heavily security-based, but also heavily based on religion. I heard talk about radicalization. Are all those young people in violent extremist groups, are they radical? We need to ask ourselves that question, because if we constrain the explanation to radicalization, the solution we will be putting forward will be heavily based on religion. And as you have seen in some of these life stories, the reason why young people join violent extremist groups go beyond economic reason, but also religious reason. So we need to understand these broad-based factors to be able to craft appropriate policy response to violent extremism. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the panel. I think for me, a cross-cutting thread within the presentations is the intentionality of linking research with policy and practice. Deliberately, you see the research teams engaging with civil society organizations, engaging with community leaders, engaging with security agents, engaging with governments, trying to make sure that their findings are not just for academic purposes, but really transform norms, practices, and policy, and also see to it that policy is effectively implemented and policy is responsive. Another thing that stood out for me was the importance of listening to both stated and unstated needs. I think that's very important, not just for researchers, but also for policymakers, and also for practitioners who come up with various programs targeting young people. And lastly, acknowledging the complexity of the challenges of violence and violent conflict. Sometimes, yes, economic approaches work, but also sometimes it's important to recognize the multiplicity of factors that that contribute to youth participation in violence. So anthropological, sociological, culturally sensitive approaches, psychological approaches are also needed. They need to come to bear in the way we engage with the challenges that face us. Thank you very much for such insightful presentations and for sharing your experiences from the field. So we'll break for lunch. Lunch is served just outside here. Okay. All right. Thank you very much.